So if we want to make our upcycled objects competitive with others on the market, we need to think carefully about their appearance. So one of the things we're going to look at next is aesthetic principles. And to do this, we're going to refer to the work of Andy Goldsworthy, and he's famous for working with nature and arranging it in particular patterns and then photographing it. In his work, he actually addresses a lot of the kind of aesthetic principles we're going to be considering. A lot of the ideas that we're talking about here are described in this book, Universal Principles of Design. The authors are Butler, Holden and Lidwell. So this and 99 other universal design principles, some of them about the visual properties of design, some of them about other matters, but it's a very good reference for what we're talking about. So understanding our perception mechanisms can help to understand why some objects are more attractive than others. And this is the kind of thing that cognitive psychologists would study. We understand more about the way we sense information, the way we sort it in our minds, and the way we store it in memory. And all of these things can be relevant to the way we look at things, and all that influences whether we find them attractive looking or not. So we can talk about something called our cognitive load, which is basically the amount of effort our brains are having to go to take in visual information and other sensory information. There is an argument that what we're trying to do when we're designing is optimise that cognitive load, so we're not having to perceive too much and not too little. Somebody's created this normalised graph that shows the amount of cognitive load against the amount of attention that we pay to something that we're looking at. So if this is the maximum visual load, this is the minimum, there's a happy medium somewhere in between, which is this optimum point where we're paying the most attention to something. So if we've got very bland design, it doesn't get our attention and it's therefore not attractive. And if we've got too much going on, if there's too much visual clutter, again, it becomes unattractive to us because our brains are having to do too much to actually understand it. So generally speaking, with optimising our cognitive load, less is more. Often designers err on the side of creating too much visual clutter, and the more pared down and simple an object appears, frequently the more attractive it will actually be. So we can illustrate the concept of simplicity by looking at these two photographs. If we look at the left-hand side one, it's quite a complex image. It's got lots of different shapes and colours, all cluttering up our visual field. On the right-hand side, we've got a much simpler version of the same scene where we focused in on one flower. The Gestalt psychologists would call this a figure and ground effect as well, with the large purple flower creating the foreground, and our brains telling us that the rest of it is just background noise. So it's less complex for us to take in. And generally speaking, most people would find the image on the right hand side clearer and also more attractive. So Andy Goldsworthy's work is notable for its simple, clear messages and distinct visual themes, and is going to provide a really good reference for us to consider how these aesthetic principles have been applied to three-dimensional form. So an obvious designer look is the minimalist style, a tradition that relies on subtraction and preserving empty space, and that's part of a quote from Togojin Yoshioka, and there's an example there of a hotel interior. So some examples that have been upcycled, they've used the materials in that kind of very minimalistic way. On the right is just reclaimed wood, but a very simple form that it's been applied to. And on the left-hand side, a very simple lampshade as well. It's actually used lolly sticks, but it looks like so much more. So another principle that is commonly used to sort of create more attractive objects that require less cognitive processing is the idea of self-similarity, which also creates unified themes. Some people prefer to call it creating unity. In maths, they describe a self-similar object where the whole object is similar to a part of itself. So the whole has the same shape as one or more of its parts, and this applies also to art subject. It simplifies the number of forms our eye has to actually see, and that creates a unified, coherent message. So another example of self-similarity in this upcycled tea set. So an element of novelty here as well. Obviously they've used deconstruction and reconstruction to create this. Here we've got the repeated theme of palettes. They've sort of used colour changes and a generally neutral background to create the effect. But you can see the repeated aesthetic there. So another way to create unified themes is with colour. Self-similarity of different tones of the same shade of colour perhaps, or perhaps just picking a very simplified set of complementary colours and repeating them throughout a design. So these upcycled scenes have used that principle to make them less complex on the eye and more visually pleasing. So if this had been multicoloured, this yellow scene or the pink scene, it would have been much more complex. Another example is where they've used just simple textures to contrast with this whole range of colours. This kind of interesting chair made out of an old shopping trolley, an old discarded shopping trolley that's obviously, no use to anybody anymore, made into this seat, and then using these kind of reduced array of colours and textures. So a related design property that influences the aesthetics of objects is similarity. In this case, we're repeating the same shape. It's not part of the whole necessarily. It also creates a common visual theme, and actually it's just used sometimes to create the design itself. Another beautiful example of Andy Goldsworthy's photography of one of his sculptures, just repeating the theme of the stone here. So common typical designs, this piece of photography is simply based on that idea of repeated shapes. This stationery, similarly, just using repeated logos to actually make a more interesting design. So this is used for upcycling quite commonly. This is just using the theme of a coat hanger, repeating it to make an attractive fruit bowl. Obviously they've used the beauty of the wood itself and the shape of the wood itself. Again, on its own, it's not particularly interesting. So here we've got disused skateboards, and we've got a reference there for some of the work of this company, Artboard. Disused skateboards actually creating wall tiles. So they've got the kind of the repeated similar shape, but on top of that, that makes it okay to create this kind of more diverse pattern, use of lots of different colours. So what we're having to do is just take in one shape and repeat its properties again in our mind, which makes it less cognitive load. We've got some other uses of skateboards and other different sports objects. Again, on their own, they're not particularly interesting. This is also used with the repeated different elements. So in this case, they've taken some vintage textiles, unified colour schemes as before. Some more examples, just repeating that kind of circular shape. Here we've got clock design, but more repeated circles, another clock design, repeated forms again. So studies in perception have been quite influential for design. Often the work of a particular group called Gestalt psychologists are referred to. They're a group of people around 1900, Kurt Koffger, Max Wertheimer and Wolfgang Kohler. A lot of their theories stem from the belief that the whole, or the Gestalt, is more than a sum of its constituent parts. So if we take, for example, a piece of music, the music itself is a lot more than the notes individually that make it up. And similarly, we will see objects as a whole, and then we'll break it down after that into what its individual parts are. So one example of their theory is the idea that shapes that can be quite apparently complex are simplified in our mind. We reduce complexity and we see that as an oval or an ellipse. This suggests that that's what we prefer to do, that we prefer to gather things in our minds as wholes, reduce that cognitive load. So a couple of designs here, Eric Arnier, the Puppy Me Too collection. So these designs illustrate the effect that the pared down profile can have on the eye. Here's an example from upcycling. Obviously these are much simplified versions of the human figure. Laser cuttings frequently used as a method for upcycling because you can use discarded materials and create new and interesting shapes from it. Another example of a Gestalt principle is that the identification of features depends on whether they're seen to have significance. If objects have that whole quality, they are seen as more significant. So for example, the square in this image will stand out. It's seen as more important. Also, if we see, which is basically, this is a curved line with a gap in it, we would actually see that as a circle, an open circle. So here we've got some upcycled examples. You can see clearly the ellipse here standing out from the rest of the environment, making quite a striking looking object. Some kind of frame, not sure what it's from, has been turned into sort of a very over the top bed. And here we have, obviously clocks are usually round, but that sort of shape will also mean that it has significance and stand out from its environment. So taking the idea of wholeness a little bit further, Gestalt theory would say that if you can achieve a common purpose with separate elements as well, it will make understanding and comprehension easier and again make something more attractive. So another example of Andy Goldsworthy's work here, just taking the stones and making a common part of a spiral, spirals being an attractive objects in themselves, as we'll look at later. And this theme is commonly used throughout design. For example, lots of the lampshades, although they're quite simple shapes, they're repeated and all made to be part of the profile, is made to be part of the whole shape. So these upcycled examples provide an excellent illustration of the significance of wholeness with the Gestalt. For example, this designer chandelier upcycled version. Individual elements of broken crockery can be quite hideous really and are usually thrown away, but reinterpreted into this crockery explosion they become a lot more exciting. Here we've got a clock made of ties, and again these broken useless crayons take on a whole new meaning when they're formed into letter shapes and become art. So now some simple ideas that actually come from graphic design. If we have a series of objects, actually whether they're 2D or 3D, and we line them up spatially, that will reduce our cognitive load, simply because we're trying to compute the position of one item, and then our brains can simply note that the object is repeated along a certain dimension. Whereas if these things were randomly placed, your brain has to compute the position of each one. It refers to the use of grids for graphic design. There are several different grid systems that are preferred by the human eye as well. But simply for the purposes of upcycling, it's just useful to know that lining things up in that way is useful. Another one is the use of white space. This is Ben McDonald's website. He's a garden designer, landscape designer. He uses this principle quite well, which is the idea of leaving gaps for the eye. So again, although this is a two-dimensional example, it does also apply to products in 3 dimensions. In this example, he's also used a range of different media, which is something that applies to graphics. He's used photography, illustration and text, and he's used lots of different punctuation techniques for marking out the text and making it understood by different parts of the brain. But here's an example where these principles have been used. Yes, there's a lot of visual unity, that they've used the white colour throughout, but they have also tried to line objects up. If you were to create a series of grids, you would notice that they have used that technique there. And there's obviously not too much visual clutter. They're trying to add that visual white space, which works really well. So just a few more simple tips. Obviously, if you can find objects that are pretty cool before you start, that's a really big bonus. So these are old-fashioned measuring sticks. You can add humour. A lot of the objects we've noticed on here are quite quirky and interesting. If you're going to use older things for a new purpose, that's one way to increase the value, make them more entertaining and more amusing. This is a fantastic design using these toy soldiers for this fruit bowl design. And also just be innovative. Use processes like synectics, which means connecting two completely different things. So the idea of connecting mosaics with toilets, for example. Semiotic profiling, which is the subject of a different lecture. So identifying areas where there are products that haven't been upcycled previously. And not forgetting as well that human beings generally do love nature and the proportions that nature gives us. Since the Renaissance, lots of artists and architects have used a certain proportion called the golden ratio. This is approximately what it is. If we look at this, which is called an Archimedean spiral, the way the proportions work with the Archimedean spiral relates to this golden ratio, and we see it in nature. This is a butterfly antennae, this is a burr from a burdock bush, and this is the natural growth of ferns. So again, this is used in the work of Andy Goldsworthy, those themes from nature and the proportions from nature, and it's something you can also add to upcycled objects or anything that's been designed, and it will make them more pleasing to people. And of course the idea of actually including nature in upcycled objects or in any of the themes that we use will always be attractive to most people. Bringing nature to sort of urban areas here, but we're also using natural themes with our designs. So I hope that these ideas about aesthetics will help you to create upcycled objects that will compete with other things on the market. And put together with the ideas in part 1, all the tips and hints about materials and different construction methods, will actually enable you to create products that are feasible and will be able to be produced. So I look forward to seeing some great ideas. Good luck with it.